Hello and welcome to the Air at Cosmos studio, where we'll discuss a crucial topic, the Malaysia Airlines 370. Netflix released a series of, I don't know if we can really call them documentaries, but it kind of annoyed us. Today we've invited experts Gilles and Jean-Luc. Could you reintroduce yourselves?
Hi, Xavier Teitelman, former Air Force air traffic controller. I investigated and published 2 technical books on the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines 370. So it's a subject that I actively follow.
Jean-Luc.
Hello, Jean-Luc Marchand. I worked at Eurocontrol. I am a signal processing engineer. I recently published multiple studies on the Malaysia Airlines, the latest being with Patrick Belly, an airline captain.
So before analyzing this famous documentary, maybe we could just go over the facts. What do we know for sure, and what are our sources on the Malaysia Airlines 310, for example, the beginning of the flight?
The flight was proceeding normally until the point of control transfer between Malaysia and Vietnam. At that moment, we have the plane responding to Malaysian control, and in the following minute, the pilot does not contact Vietnam. There is no exchange, and the transponder is off. We have facts showing this transponder was switched off. The knob was turned through positions that show it was manually operated. The plane then makes a U-turn, disappearing from civilian secondary radar traces, making it invisible to civilians. After that, only military radars are tracking it, but there are also some civilian radars that followed it. Jean-Luc can talk about that much better than I can. We have a plane that crosses Malaysia, then goes to the other side of Malaysia, and apparently ends up in the Indian Ocean. With technical details,
that is, when you turn off the transponder, you become invisible to civilian controllers. But what about primary radars? What are those?
Yes, so the transponder responds to an interrogation. And when you turn it off, there are several positions, and it will respond differently depending on those positions. But when you put it on standby, it doesn't respond anymore. And so the secondary radar doesn't see it anymore, so the civilian controller doesn't see it anymore. On the other hand, there are primary radars that simply emit an echo and receive that echo to measure the distance. And the azimuth where the plane is, that's visible because you can't turn that off on board.
Here we're dealing with a metallic mass that reflects waves, and that continued after the transponder was turned off. Radar data shows that the plane continued flying until it reached the Strait of Malacca.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yes, that's right. Up to the last radar echo at 1822.12. There, we know for sure that it was in that area. It took some time to reconstruct the tracks because it was different civilian approach radars that captured it in addition to the military ones. And it was necessary to do a kind of overlay of the tracks to make sure it was really the same plane and that we were really talking about the same thing. But the systems didn't understand that it was the same flight. They were pieces, little segments put one after the other with gaps in between.
And how can we be sure that in the end it was really this plane that made it all the way to the Strait of Malacca?
First of all, by process of elimination, because there weren't many other planes in the area. It was nighttime, there wasn't much traffic. We were able to track the others, and that one, we followed it because, as humans, we followed the traces and figured that logically it could only be that one.
There's also that famous ping from the co-pilot's cell phone, which connects to the ground.
So there you have it, the correlation. Indeed, at that spot south of Penang, the phone connected to a cell tower, and that clearly indicates the plane was there. This supported the notion that the route passed through the area and that the tracked plane was indeed the one in question.
Now at that spot, something else also happens. The plane starts communicating with the satellite again. That's it.
that's it. A few minutes after the plane reached the edge of radar range, the satellite system reconnects on board the plane and it requests to reconnect to the network. And when we compare the last radar position with the arc that the satellite system physically gives us, we realize that it's perfectly reachable for the plane. But one thing is certain, the plane is no longer in the South China Sea at all. That's obvious.
So how do we know from the satellite information? Because the plane doesn't send any positioning information, does it? How do we determine its location at that point? Jean-Luc is better suited to discuss this than me.
So Inmarsat has 2 systems that they use operationally to check the quality of their network. Not at all to track planes, but afterwards you can reconstruct. And thanks to 2 fundamental elements. One is a time measurement, a delay between the message the plane sends back and communication with the ground, and this delay will give a distance. This is called build to order. And the other information is about the frequency. The plane has a very simple system for correcting the Doppler effect because it goes very fast and it makes an error, and this error is measurable. So, on the ground, afterwards, we are able to measure this error. So, these two pieces of information will give us both a distance, that is, a sphere radius on which the plane is probably located. Now, since it is at a certain altitude above the Earth, we will cross-check. And we'll say that these are rings at a certain altitude, obviously. But these rings don't have the same diameter depending on the altitude. You have to keep that in mind. And then, the burst frequency offset mainly gives us an indication of how the plane was behaving locally, what its speed was, and how it was oriented in relation to the satellite.
So that means the plane is queried by the satellite and the response time is measured in billionths of a second. That allows us to determine a distance, since we have a round-trip time, and the frequency allows us to do that. It's similar to the Doppler effect. We can determine if the satellite and plane are moving closer or farther apart. That's essentially it. This information enables us to trace a path leading into the southern Indian Ocean.
I wouldn't even say just one trajectory, but rather a lot of trajectories. You must understand that from these elements, investigators, especially Inmarsat, had to make several hypotheses. We're discussing speed alone, but specifically speed alone. You must recalculate using the plane's flying speed. This is about our speed in a plane. Speed in Mach depends on wind conditions. The winds differ at various altitudes, so assumptions about the plane's altitude must be made. Inmarsat calculated numerous trajectories, and we have diagrams illustrating the exact paths of these different trajectories. And so, depending on the altitude and speed, the final trajectory on the last arc is not the same at all. So you really have to understand that there are so many assumptions that need to be made that we have to, let's say, narrow down these assumptions a bit to have an area where we estimate the search location. The last arc isn't the plane's final position, just its last signal. Exactly. After that, make assumptions about whether the plane was piloted, then define search areas based on those assumptions. It's not that simple, especially if we consider the possibility that someone might have been piloting the plane. If we take the broadest hypothesis, we're talking about several million square kilometers on and around this arc. It's not feasible financially or in terms of time. We need to make assumptions and narrow it down to find an area that's easier to work with.
So, first question, how do we know that this data, which was recorded by Inmarsat, how do we know it wasn't tampered with or made up afterwards?
First of all, you pretty much have to be an equipment manufacturer to know what's inside the boxes on board the plane. And then, there are very few ways to alter that, because to modify this data, you would have to go almost everywhere in the aircraft. Modifying numerous computers, changing and implementing a lot of software would be impossible.
How can we be sure Inmarsat didn't fabricate this data set?
Inmarsat's credibility is definitely on the line, but you can always question that yourself. That they took some time to verify the data, that they looked into it, and above all, they have no interest in doing otherwise. They have no interest in making things up, because for the air... 447.
They had
helped a lot, and that here, it was an almost similar circumstance. So yeah, you can always have doubts. But here, you really have to go very far to believe in a conspiracy, and to think that they actually tampered with the data.
Because the data itself is quite rich. For example, they even take into account things like the satellite's micro-oscillations, or when the satellite passes through the Earth's shadow, and that in the days that followed, when they shared this data, was it data we already knew about?
So it took some time to understand that it was heading south and not north. We had to do quite a lot of statistical analysis and look at other similar flights. And they looked at the behavior of this data specifically, and by mimicry or by correlation, they concluded that the data from the 370 was actually correlated toward the south rather than the north. But yes, it was important to understand whether it was the oscillator or the satellite eclipse to know why this data included a behavior that was not expected at first. But once we understood that, well, that's it, it was done.
That's also why we can't reproduce this flight to test it again. The passage through the Earth's shadow is not reproducible because it depends on the wind and other variable factors.
Exactly, it wasn't predictable. And where? Connecting in the boxes was impossible. And besides, modifying the software to change all the aircraft's position and attitude data is impossible. Moreover, the redundancies rendered the plane unflyable.
So, at the end of the flight, we arrive in the southern Indian Ocean and we have debris.
Not right away.
Because
The investigation yielded no results. It's important to understand the reasons behind this outcome. We explained it in the last show. First, because the area was very remote, the plane spent very little time in the sector. The weather didn't help, and especially the search area. You have to realize that we basically started searching about 20 days after the plane disappeared. If we start searching for debris 20 days post-crash, on average, it's expected to be around 700 kilometers away. The debris from the missing plane is likely in Marseille, not Paris. Search efforts should focus on Marseille. So already, it's not that simple. Then everything was also regularly changed depending on what we had detected from the pings. We searched along this seventh arc, but the area itself is huge, and yet we found nothing. We only found debris. Just a year and a half later, the flaperon was found. It's the first piece that was recovered, and there's quite a bit said about it on Netflix.
we'll discuss the flaperon. Are we still with it? There are more than 20 pieces of debris, I'd say around 30, from Malaysia Airlines, 370. They keep coming in, they keep coming in. Do we have certainty that some of this debris is authentic?
There's not too much reason to doubt it. So the doubt that's raised in Netflix is the fact that the flaperon doesn't have its registration plate. There are plenty of reasons why this flaperon doesn't have that registration plate, but not only because the part or the plane was dismantled. Also, what's being questioned is...
I can say a little something about that, yes? So when that piece of the flaperon was found at the time, there was a cable news network report that was shown live. What exactly was a flaperon on the plane? The flaperon in the cable news network image is missing its plate, likely due to the sky draw. Plates can fall off for various reasons. It's not only during dismantling, indeed, either it
can fall off, or maybe from the very beginning they weren't even there yet. Maybe they were added later on for the identification of this flaperon, which is quite questioned in Netflix. About the fact that it was written by hand on a slip, nothing surprising. Here's the photo of the slip. We realize it's not the only handwritten item on this slip. So relying on that to say the item isn't properly authenticated? No, I'm sorry. There aren't 36,000 flaperons that ended up in the Indian Ocean. There aren't 36,777 that ended up in the Indian Ocean.
And by the way, there are other parts that are flaps, and even some that are interior pieces of the plane.
And that have been identified because the materials match, the honeycomb matches the thickness, the paint. So there are plenty of reasons why, indeed, the parts are very likely. So there are still 7 or 8 that are identified as certain.
Because there are unique serial numbers.
Here are some recorded serial numbers. Each manufacturer has its own quality process. For some, like Casa, it's done by hand, while for others, it's more computerized and engraved. By the way, inside the bottle, there were engraved numbers.
Yes, which have been authenticated.
But they are often generic numbers, like most of the pieces. So that's why we can't formally identify them with this bottle, except for this number.
So in the information that we also know for sure, these signals, these exchanges between the satellite and the plane, they inform us about several things. There are what we call log-on requests. What does that mean?
So when a satellite communications, that is a modem or a mobile phone for the plane, let's say, needs to connect, it has to follow a certain protocol and it has to request the establishment of a connection through the satellite network. And so at that point, there's a set of data packets that are exchanged to say, I am this modem with this number, and especially with this flight number. That's important. We might talk about that a bit later. And that the crew entered this flight number. And in addition to the identifier, like the personal unblocking code number or your phone, that will be transmitted to the network, which says, very well, you have permission to connect. We're going to establish a connection. They check all that and they establish a connection. And from there, a whole series of exchanges follows to set up all the systems. Whether it's the set itself with its different frequencies or the in-flight entertainment.
The system of...
It provides entertainment and enables communication, including addressing passengers. This critical system will connect and establish connections, especially providing internet to passengers.
In this case, there are numerous exchanges in the plane, including the logon request. The system experienced a power outage, and this indicates the restoration of power to the equipment.
So, when we see at 1825 this connection request, it means that indeed for the plane it had been disconnected. The network itself was saying, I have no one, but as long as no one talks to it, it doesn't worry too much. On the other hand, the plane sent this login, and this login is definitely a login of awakening, resetting, and starting over, if you will, of restarting. Whereas we might have expected just a simple little wake up saying, I'm still here. No, this is really a proper connection request.
So power outage, power restoration.
Hence the deduction that there was a power outage.
Another piece of information not included in the message is the frequency of the first transmission. Can we say a few words about that? Because there's a difference compared to the normal expected frequency of this restoration.
I want to briefly mention the flight identifier you brought up. When we reconnect, we have the modem identifier that connects to the network. What Jean-Luc and Patrick managed to do is dig into what's called the flight identification. Strangely, we should have had this flight identification because it's stored in memory, but we don't have it anymore. And the whole question is to find out why. The text still suggests an intentional action within the cockpit.
That's right, because indeed, normally, the flight number appears in the communications. And here, in this one, at 6:25 p.m., the flight number disappeared. And that clearly means that someone deliberately went into the pages of the flight computer to go and erase that number because he cut off all communications. And so one of the consequences is that indeed this number disappears.
This flight ID could only disappear for that reason. We can't find any other explanation.
That's the only one. To erase it during flight, you must perform a data link reset.
I'll return to the second question. I wasn't aware of that information. The frequency of this first transmission isn't exactly what would be expected in normal communication. Can we explain that?
Yes, absolutely. Because actually, when the device wakes up, it's cold. So, it's at the back, at the top of the cabin, not far from the luggage compartments. We don't know the exact temperature, but it cooled down. And it needs to heat up to have a stable frequency. And so we have what we call an oven that will heat the small enclosure, which will heat the crystal. And it takes some time to reach frequency. So first to reach temperature, then frequency. The frequency curve will change. And at the moment of connection, you can clearly see a change in frequency.
And that was well explained. This was analyzed as potential evidence that there was a depressurization, a cooling of the plane beyond normal. That's one of the hypotheses.
That's one of the possible hypotheses, but nothing is certain. In any case, what we know is that it's cold and that indeed it takes some time to come back up. So obviously, if the cabin was depressurized and cooled down, it gets even colder.
So let me go back to what we are sure of. There was a manual disconnection in the cockpit and we don't know the cause. A plane tracked by civilian and military radars will cross the entire peninsula.
I think I'll give you a point on that. Jean-Luc did a great job on the radars, and we've managed to determine which radars tracked the plane. Because with all these associations, sometimes you have to track down the radars, and he did an enormous job on that as well. It's super interesting, I guess.
Had also done
that work. It's very interesting, and it also helps to confirm those elements.
We arrive, we have a cell phone that will connect to the ground, which confirms that we're following the right plane. The re-established communications between the satellite and plane prove it kept flying for hours. Dozens of debris pieces have been recovered. So, we agree these are facts. Now, we're going to break down the first theory that's mentioned on Netflix with Jeff Wise. So, I'll make it simple for you. There are 3 Russians on the plane by chance. One of them is in business class, making it super easy for him. He's going to sneak into the electronic bay of the Boeing 777 without anyone noticing. He's going to hide underneath again, and he'll put the little carpet back so no one can see that he's hiding. He's going to connect with computers on the Boeing 777, and from the electronic bay, he'll be able to fly the plane and modify the signals that are emitted by the plane to convince people that he ultimately did not travel north, as he was assumed to have gone north to reach Kazakhstan, because it's the secret services who want to recover it. And so he supposedly managed to change the frequencies. It makes me laugh when I say it, to head south. First thing, can we control or take over the plane from the electronics bay? No.
Clearly no. So that's that. That's already the first big point, but there's another big point. Well, what really gets my attention is what's behind that. He depressurizes the plane to make everyone pass out. The problem is, okay, I get that he does that, but how does he breathe afterward?
He has some really good oxygen on his side.
So that's something else to add. And what happened to that plane? So there are a whole bunch of theories. So why did Jeff Wise go with that one? You should know that a little before he split from the independent group had worked on a northern trajectory that could be explained with the satellite data. But what Jeff Wise doesn't say is that they did that work, but they twisted some information, especially the burst frequency offset data, to make it fit. Frequency data, that's it, the burst frequency offset we discussed earlier. They studied the possibility of, I guess at that time. Then after what happened, obviously, Jeff Wise retrieved data that Malaysia had provided to the independent group and published them, while the independent group had agreed with the authorities to say, no, we won't disclose that Jeff Wise did it. So after that, he was excluded from the independent group. So there were tensions between them. You can see it anyway. There are tensions between Jeff Wise and the independent group.
And so the idea that you could control, because when we talk about it with pilots, they tell us if my plane was hacked, what does the pilot do? There's a button.
The big fantasy was believing that Americans could remotely fly a plane and all that. In fact, there is so much redundancy in the onboard computers that to hack them, you really have to control everything, shut everything down. At that point, the plane can't be flown anymore.
An off button allows switching back to manual control, then
the pilot has the final say and can take back control of the plane at the last moment, switching to direct law.
Switch the primary flight controls button to disconnect. Basically, you disconnect all the onboard computers of the plane, and that prevents using computers that send incorrect data. So there's a way to separate all of that. Then what that also means is that the takeover is over the entire plane, over the control of the plane, which is completely absurd. And the first inconsistency is the plane's turnaround, and Jean-Luc and Patrick have demonstrated that. You can only do it by
manual, that is to say,
by touching the stick, and not something from the cargo hold. Or you would have to remove access to the radio, access to the satellite system, access to a lot of things. It doesn't hold up technically due to the unrealized complexity.
The scenario is still a bit strange, a bit. You'd already have to go down into that hold. I don't know if you've seen on a 777. I went to check when I was in the United States, talked with the pilot who after 5 minutes kicked me out. By the way, because he said to me, who's this guy? But we were on the hatch and the hatch wasn't visible. So the carpet was full, completely covering the corridor between the cockpit and the roller. So you first have to roll up this carpet. So during the day, at the moment, when all the cabin crew are preparing their cart, they're in the roller. I mean, it's hard to go there with a laptop under your arm.
Excuse me, I'm going into the hold, and it's quite early at the beginning of the flight anyway, and it's quite
early at the beginning of the flight. Then you have to go down. So as Gilles said, the bottles, if they depressurize, they still have to be well prepared. And then what should be done in this hold? He can't connect. To connect, he has to disconnect the devices. Or else he needs some very special plugs, but who has those? They won't allow the machine to be interrupted during the flight, because during the flight, we don't touch them.
In any case, it's absurd. And for me, there's something that's shocked me, and that's for you to explain. And so, supposedly, he's going to alter the plane's transmissions to the satellite to make it look like the plane went south when it actually went north. That means they had decided in advance that we would come up with a method to track the plane, and based on that, he would have altered the data. That's right.
That's exactly it. It's really like science fiction, actually. And on top of that, imagine what kind of data the plane would send to the ground. In that case, it's a real challenge because it's random.
Especially since we're actually on the frequency that's recorded by the satellite. It's not the plane that's sending information through the ground station. It's the ground that's recording. It's the ground station.
However, we could still imagine that if I have perfect knowledge and control over everything, I could make it appear that way. But that's impossible. There are too many systems.
Including the satellite's micro-oscillations and its passage through Earth's shadow. So that one, we don't really believe in it. Now let's discuss the second theory, which we'll refer to as the Florence de Changy theory. In this one, I'll sum it up for you quickly. There were supposedly American airborne warning and control system planes that arrived in the area and intercepted the Boeing 777 from Mesa Airlines. They supposedly jammed it, hacked it, and told it to divert to another area. And when it refused, the plane was allegedly shot down, possibly with a laser weapon. According to his book, he doesn't mention it much anymore, as it lacked credibility from the start. So, first, can we intercept and jam a plane in his broadcasts?
When I hear that, I jump out of my skin, sorry. As a former air traffic controller specialized in interceptions, I've already done it. That would mean we have a plane, so a Boeing, on which, she says, there are even two airborne warning and control systems, one above, one below. And so we had this plane escorted all the way to the Chinese border. The first inconsistency I notice is that the maximum speed of an airborne warning and control system is incompatible with the cruising speed of a Boeing 777. That means if we manage to intercept the plane, it means the airborne warning and control system are constantly being left behind because the plane is faster than they are. That means that by the time they reach the Chinese border, the airborne warning and control system have already been trailing behind for quite a while. That's the second inconsistency after the first one. The topic being discussed is jamming. She cites a former United States Air Force member who said that airborne warning and control system have phenomenal jamming capabilities. Now I'm wondering, why am I wondering? Because actually, there's a big confusion about a system that was installed on American Airborne Warning and Control System starting in 2012 on Block 25 or Block 35. I don't recall the exact modification. They installed an electronic warfare system in the American Airborne Warning and Control System. And not only that, the French Airborne Warning and Control System are equipped with it too, what we call the SM. The problem is when we talk about electronic warfare, what do we think of right away? No, this isn't a travel system. It's the two bumps on the side of the plane. And these are systems for locating, detecting, and identifying radars. It means we detect a radar and link it to a radar contact. And that allows the airborne warning and control system to tell the fighter jets it controls, there, that's the target to attack, it's right there. We received radar from that aircraft in that direction, confirming it's a MiG-29 or Sukhoi 27.
Because we can authenticate what type of radar is facing us, and so we can know its
position and type, that's it. It enables us to alert fighter jets, advise them to take precautions based on what's ahead, and adjust their tactics appropriately. And here, this confusion is related to what's been installed in the Airborne Warning and Control System since 2012 on the American Airborne Warning and Control System. Jamming the Airborne Warning and Control System is impossible because it's incompatible with how an Airborne Warning and Control System operates. To use an Airborne Warning and Control System for jamming, it must be positioned closer to the target transmitter. But an Airborne Warning and Control System, you want to keep it far away.
We agree that the Boeing 777 Malaysia Airlines 36 is sending it here. It's not the one you need to jam. In that case, you'd have to jam all the radars, all the
controllers.
Air traffic controllers on the ground. You're detecting not just one, but a wide range of jamming signals across various spectrums. First, with radar jamming, it means you have to do targeted jamming on every radar tracking the plane. So that already means you have to target several radars. Already, it's not that simple. Next, radio jamming. Clearly, the plane can no longer communicate with air traffic control. And here, the first inconsistency. Florence Deschangier explains to me how the Airborne Warning and Control System managed to contact the plane to tell it to change course. If they jammed it, it's inconsistent. The third parameter would mean the SATCOM was also jammed. So here too, we're dealing with a different range of frequencies, a completely different direction. I even doubt that it's actually possible. So already when we look at this, we think it's not reasonable. That is the information she got from this former soldier. Before throwing that out there and making up all sorts of scenarios, the least you can do is study and verify the information you're given. Because here, obviously, technically, I see a whole bunch of inconsistencies that need to be addressed.
That doesn't work. If you jam a sensor, like a radar, you can flood it with interference, rendering it useless.
A lot of waves.
And you'll saturate it. That's it.
But that doesn't make a plane stealthy. That means we'll make noise to mask the radar in a cloud of many other radars so that the operator's on the ground. But above all, the purpose of jamming is to prevent the systems that can fire missiles from locking onto the right radar. So we're going to send it dozens or thousands to jam it and tell it, no, in the end you can't figure out which one it is. So that's how it works. It doesn't work by making a plane disappear.
Let's suppose we're all incompetent, and that's the correct answer. The plane was shot down there. We do have people telling us, I saw debris in the water with Tom Nod back then. There are satellite photos that were taken, shared with the whole world, and people were able to look and try to find plane debris. So we have people who are very convinced they saw something. Is it credible?
It's not at all. I grinned when I saw that Netflix segment, particularly due to the visuals. I have complete faith in this individual's sincerity. But when you look at the diagrams of the plane, which are matched with what she says she has, we at least have a diagram of a Boeing plane. 777 from the front. Thinking about it a little, we're looking at an image taken from space almost vertically. And what this person identifies is a plane seen from the front, and it's not just that. There are a whole bunch of elements, but that's not possible. Actually, people see what they want, especially since the image quality is really more than average. Also, what I've noticed on social media, especially on sites that are interested in the 3110 match, is that it has renewed some people's interest in looking for images like that. Now, just yesterday, I saw someone who had filmed something they saw on their computer on Google Earth. Below, you can see the date 2022. Basically, the person is looking for Malaysia Airlines 370 on a satellite image, which was taken in 2022.
Yeah, that's going to work really well. Nevertheless, Florence de Changy puts forward some points, such as the fact that part of the cargo wasn't checked and didn't go through the scanner, according to her. Is that true? And in the end, is that really something totally abnormal?
That's it. I had the same reaction. I was shocked. And what's great is that Netflix gives us proof that Florence de Changy isn't telling us the whole truth. In the image shown in the documentary, there's an excerpt from a report that Florence de Changy uses as her source. It says that the Motorola cargo was not scanned. It's true, it's written there. What she's leaving out is what's in that same paragraph. What it says is that Motorola's cargo was physically inspected before leaving the cargo area by security personnel who were accredited. And in addition, it was sealed. And the procedures for this kind of cargo, it's from the moment it comes from a known sender that it's checked by an approved company. When it arrives at the airport, they just check the seals. There's no reason to physically re-inspect or even do a scan. What we know, obviously, is that the scanners weren't big enough to handle this kind of cargo, but the inspection was done. Once again, I protest about that. We have a task force that only tells us part of the truth and leaves out things like this. It bothers me that we're not being told everything.
And so every day, all over the world, planes take off with part of the cargo, which is checked with dogs, with lots of things, but which hasn't necessarily gone through a scanner. That's normal. The meal trays.
The process remains unchanged. The bags are inspected and sealed before arriving at the airport, not after. And if it's sealed, there's no compromise on the seals. The freight, it's not rescanned at all.
She also mentions that military exercises were happening simultaneously with the plane's disappearance. No.
That's not true. I made a full video discussing Cobra Gold and Cop Tiger. One of the exercises, a troop landing exercise, had ended about a week and a half earlier. Cop Tiger started 2 days after the disappearance, contrary to previous statements. I have no doubt that she inquired about it and knew. So I wonder why she's saying things that she actually checked at least a little. You just have to look on
the internet, you can find it. Anyway, I even did the
list of planes to see if there were any American Airborne Warning and Control System. There weren't any. The Airborne Warning and Control System was Singaporean Airborne Warning and Control System, so not American Airborne Warning and Control System.
It is also said in the report that the second search area, which was on the side of the Strait of Malacca, basically the Malaysians are going to make it up. I don't remember how many days, 4, 5, 6 days later. Do we have any evidence to the contrary? It's
false, it's false. Even Gailen Watrolo, who's been saying it for a while, I recently disproved him. I didn't dare do it before, but it's false. Within 24 hours of the plane's disappearance, the Prime Minister's office announced the opening of a search area on the other side of Malaysia, because they're not ruling out that the plane might have turned around. The next day, a press conference was held. The Director of Civil Aviation opened the conference by saying, as you know, since yesterday, since the Prime Minister's statement, well, since the Prime Minister's press release, a second search area has been opened in the Strait of Malacca. At this conference, we're discussing it and even have an Air Force general talking about these radar tracks. They're not sure it's Malaysia Airlines 370 because the transponder is missing. As a controller, if there's a primary radar signal without a transponder or pilot contact, I can't confirm if it's the specific plane in question. So they were cautious at first because they weren't sure. They then waited to get further confirmations. By the third day, journalists were shown maps with the search areas. We have those images.
We will link these videos again for people to verify what we're saying. I
published these videos to show what was said in the first days. I published these videos on my YouTube account to say, look and check for yourself and don't necessarily believe everything you're told.
It's important to note that Malaysians lacked experience dealing with this type of disaster.
Unfortunately.
And their communication was hesitant and poorly managed. And in conclusion, it brought a lot of confusion to the messages they tried to convey, and it made things complicated.
Of course, 2 short testimonials as well from people who would support this experience of Changi. We have Mr. McKay, who is on an oil rig. A platform, he says, but I saw the plane explode in the sky. Can we take that? Well, I'm convinced that he saw something.
Possible, but already in terms of distance, did you check?
So he probably saw something. It's not impossible. Each of us has seen things at night during the year. There, given the position he was in on his platform, and even all the way up on top of Madame Isen, he couldn't have seen anything due to Earth's curvature. And even taking into account the possible 20% light propagation that sailors sometimes experience. So he was
Out of range. 300 nautical miles then. Basically, I'm in Paris and I see a plane exploding in Bordeaux. That's kind of what it's like.
It's not...
Very believable.
Florence de Changy also mentions this testimony in her book, which further draws my attention to it. But when journalists try to go see him, the journalists obviously know where he lives and apparently he's under house arrest. It's impossible to see him. This person, obviously, every time someone tries to go see them, no one manages to do it. I wonder, does this person really exist? That's another question I ask myself. Additionally, Florence de Changy completely omitted another crucial detail in her proposed scenario. That's not at all consistent with the place where she says the plane was shot down, meaning the place where the plane disappeared. Does that match the west of the oil platform where this person says they saw the fireball? On the other hand, if we look at where the plane was shot down, it's according to Florence de Changy. That would be completely to the north, so 90 degrees from what the person says they observed. And then the distance is even farther. So it's not credible at all.
A second testimony is used in this scenario. It's someone who, while watching television, supposedly saw images that were hidden. Then right away, especially with the plane that was by the water and a black box that he supposedly saw on television. He's the only one who remembers it.
The testimony catches the attention of Florence de Changy, as it comes from a former member of the Royal Canadian Air Force who later worked in an aeronautical electronics company. So she says this person works in aviation, so it's something credible. I was able to exchange a few words with this person. I was able to talk with him to try to understand what he had really seen. In fact, it turns out that we're dealing with someone who is extremely conspiratorial. Afterwards, it's a detail, but when he describes to me what he says and what he described, to Florence de Changy, the plane that's half submerged right on the coast, I think. Hey, that's strange. It reminds me of something. Florence de Changy questions the portrayal of the black box in a box filled with water, as that is the standard method for recovering a black box. To prevent corrosion, it's surrounded by soldiers. And when I look at that, I say to myself, oh really? An image of Lion Air that crashed in Indonesia just a few months before the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines. 370, that matches perfectly with what he says. He says that's not it. Then the black box there as well.
The margin box.
When it was shown, it matches what he says. Later, when discussing debris found in the South China Sea, he confirms it's an engine cover from the plane. The electrical wiring is the first inconsistency. It doesn't match aeronautical wiring, but he doesn't want to acknowledge that. And where we should have rivets, there are bolts. There aren't bolts on the external structure of a plane. That creates a lot of drag. Those are not the kind of parts you would find at all. He insists it's an engine cooling. I wanted to show him a photo from a Boeing manual where this part is shown. I ask him, no, it's not possible. It doesn't fit. The curvature doesn't work, and there aren't things inside that match. He realizes it's a landing gear hatch. I show him another Boeing diagram pointing out the specific features the part should have. No, now he keeps changing his mind. No, it's still a part from something else. Basically, the person is not credible at all.
He saw something on television, though it wasn't that.
And Florence from Shangin couldn't find the footage. That we're still sowing doubt.
But Netflix insists on the likelihood that it's true. There's one last thing they really insist on, and that's the famous recordings. The FBI arrived the very next day to go to the pilot's house to collect all the information, true or not.
We have no proof. Crucially, I could never verify the details shared with me by Guylaine Watolo years ago when we were still in touch. And I was never able to prove the FBI's involvement from the very first day. What we do know, and this has never been hidden by the authorities in press conferences, is that the FBI got involved in the case very quickly. Why? Because from the very beginning there were investigations into the people on board, and so of course the FBI was involved. It's a Boeing plane. American interests are potentially affected.
Regarding France's Germanwings case, the FBI was also involved. So it's, let's say, standard, but it's common that in a case where there's a potential criminal aspect, the FBI can be called in, even in such cases. In France, there isn't.
There was only one American passenger. There was only one American passenger as well. And I would even say it's that we would have been on an Airbus plane. The FBI would have been involved as well, but the French gendarmerie would have been involved in the same way. Embassies have gendarmes, but American embassies also have FBI agents. Don't assume the FBI's jurisdiction is limited to American soil. The FBI's expertise extends much further. The Malaysian authorities have been open about seeking FBI's technical assistance, particularly for the simulator. So why is the FBI unwilling to share information with French authorities, particularly Guillen's legal team? Here, we're discussing cooperation and justice issues, realizing that things don't always go smoothly. But this isn't an isolated case, Malaysia Airlines 370. There are plenty of others.
So the Egyptair.
The disappeared Mediterranean plane remains missing, with no new information and ongoing issues between France and Egypt. And it's not moving forward, and yet we hear a lot less about it, but it's still not moving forward.
So we agree. The Malaysian police recovered this flight simulator, tried to recover the data that had been erased, and when they couldn't, they eventually provided it to the FBI afterwards, maybe even from the very beginning.
From the very beginning, maybe. They even right from the start cooperated with the FBI on that matter.
According to an article, the Americans made an offer that has not been accepted yet. Malaysia initially refused the FBI's assistance, but later accepted it. Let's explore other credible options. Moving on. The Maldives. The people of the Maldives saw something that flew over them.
I think I haven't really looked into this story much, but the colors didn't match. The plane didn't match, neither did the altitude, so there were a lot of inconsistencies in what he was saying. And on top of that, the timing didn't work, and neither did the plane's endurance.
In other words, the observation occurred after the plane reached its maximum flight range based on the fuel it had at takeoff.
We're discussing Toshkwa, which is about 45 minutes away. It's not just a short trip, it's nearly an hour.
I should point out that at the time, Florence de Changy conducted the investigation and she managed to prove that this wasn't the case. She met with people in the control tower, so sometimes she does work that we can acknowledge. Exactly, Diego Garcia. It was the evil Americans who shot down the plane because the plane wanted to do another 9/11 and crash into that base.
The problem is that satellite data does not support that claim.
Yes, it doesn't match
with the information.
Satellites. And then, on top of that, the range doesn't work. It doesn't work either.
And there, we also worked with pilots from 777 who analyzed everything. We know the amount of
fuel that was...
The plane's initial trajectory suggested it lacked sufficient fuel to reach the area. And in any case, the satellites show us that there's actually a distance increasing between the plane and the satellite, not a closing in exactly. Capsio, the Christmas Islands, were you part of the Capsio team at the time?
Yes, I was part of it. Actually, at first, like Gilles said, at the beginning we have to make assumptions. And a few years ago, so 7 years already, we made the assumption based on a book by Michel Delarche and Jean-Marc Garraud, that there was indeed a hijacking by third parties and that these people wanted to negotiate or at least wanted to land. We investigated the controversial initial hypothesis that the outcome would be binary, either success or failure. From there, it leads to two different hypotheses. We initially thought it would land, either on Capsio or at Learmouth, Australia.
Christmas Island,
and then Learmouth in Australia. Both are in Australia. And so we showed that he could reach it. But actually, the answers are not, if you will. These trajectories may not provide answers to all our potential questions. We were fewer, but no, those were good starting hypotheses.
So, because scientifically, we'll explain, it was scientifically correct, but the trajectory as it had been reconstructed involved changes in altitude, speed, and course that happened exactly between the pings. And that means the probability that all these changes happened was still low. Yes, that is to say,
operationally, they are less consistent than the last study we did with Commander Blaley. It really required circumstances that made the data fit well, and so we built them that way. But operationally, it's true that a pilot would have just done a Crismos to land directly.
Without making that detour,
which would have been fatal. So, indeed, there's a little bit of...
You took a step back from your initial hypothesis. You consider yourself open-minded.
And so I'm interested in all kinds of hypotheses. And here, in the second set of hypotheses, Indeed, we go much further. We're much more precise. And above all, we practically answer all the questions that you
may have. It's an insane amount of work they've done.
People need to understand that we're sitting around the table. I think we've spent hundreds of hours and
nights
on this work. Extensive research and analysis equivalent to Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique scenarios spans thousands of pages. There are many people, including astrophysicists, who have worked and
often work discreetly because
Patrick and Jean-Luc,
Jeff Wise and Florence de Changy are currently more vocal in public compared to others. But the work they're actually doing behind the scenes, they've done an incredible job. When I say incredible, when I talked with Patrick Blady, when I met him, for the first time I had someone who made everything fit together, everything. Jean-Luc and his team accomplished an immense job.
Yes, because Patrick had started with a hypothesis that is very, very serious. However, he hadn't shown certain aspects, particularly the technical ones. And when it was necessary to detail the trajectory to be 100% credible, that's when we had to dive in so that it would match all the data. So finding the real trajectory to get there, but his basic ideas are extraordinary. It's simply about starting with aeronautical things that a basic pilot can use to build his trajectory. And it works.
By the way, a detail about the gears. We have the plane's turnaround, which has never been, they were never able to reproduce it, the authorities. Patrick and Jean-Luc managed to reproduce this turnaround
in a flight simulator.
Because actually, we looked at the radar data, and you notice that everyone relies on this radar data, and they forgot that a radar predicts. When it no longer has the echo, it loses an echo. It will wait 10 seconds, and during those 10 seconds, it predicts. And when it doesn't have it anymore. I don't have the information anymore. The controller waits. I don't have the information about... The radar track there was strange. Boeing introduced ideas by providing two reference points, a turn entry point and an exit point. And they said, here, we need to have 2 minutes and 10 seconds between the two, and we have to turn. They never managed to do it, except manually, by getting a bit closer. By saying the best time we got was manual. And we thought, it's simple, we need to keep this in a broader context. To start from Igari and see how the plane evolved. And to realize what he actually did. He started his turn earlier. And a spiral turn, that is, with an increasing bank.
It proved the plane wasn't on autopilot due to the constant turn. There you go, and in
our report, we showed that if you do it with the autopilot, you go over the
zone.
In the Thai military zone, crossing the border was not an option. Because there, you have to meet requirements and formalities that he was unable to handle, and therefore would have to wake up the Thai controllers.
Let's go over one last point about a final conspiracy theory, let's say the Freescale story, and then we'll come back to what we think about the Freescale outcome. So there were engineers on board that plane who were on the verge of revolutionizing the entire world. The Chinese were not meant to access this technology, which is why the Americans shot down the plane. So Freescale, and at that point it benefited the Rothschild family because that's just how it goes. So Freescale, what do we think about it?
It's a more recent invention because actually it's just that simple. What was at stake were patent issues, possibly engineers that the Americans might have wanted to get back. And actually, these are just simple patents for optimization, production, chips, electronic microchips. Moreover, the people, including those who filed the patents, weren't on board.
There were people with the same names. Patrick Blay did an impressive job digging deep into the project and completing everything himself.
But
everything, whether it's the captain's life, whether it's the runways, the chilly weather, all of that. He discovered the licenses and names of those on the plane. And actually, he realized that the people who were on the plane were namesakes, people who had gotten the licenses. And they weren't the same nationalities. So that's something else we don't mention. So this painstaking work, Patrick did painstaking work on all of this, on the conspiracy theories, on the private life of the captain. According to the Malaysian police report, he discovered a gap. I said it last time, it was 4 years, but actually, I think it's 6 years, where the pilot didn't have medical clearance. How can we explain that? And who noticed it? Only he did. He compiled everything, inevitably leading to the conclusion that the most likely suspect is someone well acquainted with the plane, to be able to handle a whole lot of data in the cockpit. But we end up with someone who is definitely in command. There aren't a lot of people who know how to fly a plane, who also know how to reprogram or restart certain electrical systems. To disable the flight identification, simply check the passenger list. It's a quick process.
Pilots aren't trained for that. It's more of a maintenance job.
So actually, this data link reset is apparently done before every flight. So it's a procedure that pilots are familiar with because they do it before every flight. But it's not at all meant to be done in flight.
Actually, for the data link reset, it happens automatically 9 minutes after the plane has landed and when a passenger door is opened. And then automatically the flight is cleared, so there's no confusion for the next one. When the maintenance team arrives, they'll start up the systems, but there will be no flight number at that point. And that's when the cabin crew or the pilot enters the flight number into the system, either the in-flight entertainment or on their NCDU. And at that moment, the flight has started.
All right, come on. A credible scenario now? A plausible scenario due to the vast amount of data available. Reviewing the thousands of pages in the reports would take approximately 50 days. By properly analyzing what Netflix failed to do, we can learn from their mistakes.
Nor did the two journalists who took part in it.
Yes, unfortunately. The end of the flight. To improve accuracy when dealing with vast areas, remember to keep the scale of the regions in mind. This arc is the satellite to plane distance, but in reality the accuracy is relatively uncertain. We could be 10 to 20 kilometers off to either side. Also, we don't know the plane's attitude after its final ping. Did it spiral down, as I tend to believe, or did it keep flying a little further?
So, what about the arcs? Until now, the main assumptions that guided the searches were that the plane went down steeply at the 7th arc and crashed at that point.
But going down steeply still means 30 nautical miles. We
agree, but still it's really a vertical drop. We can ask ourselves the question again. We can ask ourselves the question again by calmly going over things, by saying to ourselves, but how could a pilot, how could someone have flown this plane, piloted this plane? And depending on the speed he has, that determines the curvature of the trajectory he will have at the top. In summary, his trajectory shifts towards Christmas Island and Australia at slower speeds and towards the South Pole at faster speeds, basically.
Always along this 7th arc.
So it's not along, it's going to cross the 7th. But actually, its landing point isn't far, not too far. So now, did it fall vertically as you think in a spiral or as we think? Not that there was any manipulation by the pilot or preparation for a water landing. And at that moment, it glided, and at that moment, it could glide practically between 40 and 65 nautical miles.
150 kilometers beyond the last point, a message was sent.
Exactly. And the fact that there is little debris still shows that the impact with the water was, in principle, calm. Let's say calm. With 2-meter waves and a plane that's 6 meters in diameter, it's not calm, but it's not the Hudson River either. We agree, but it's still a clue that he didn't. Because if he had gone down in a spiral, with a descent rate supposedly of 14,000 feet per minute, that would be concrete evidence. So the plane, it's millions of fragments that we're going to find.
And we would have seen them? Nevertheless, if I play devil's advocate for your theory, some parts of the plane were found, like the part called No-Step, for example, in which the analysis of the nut holes shows that there were vibrations that apparently made it come off before it hit the ground.
Couldn't these vibrations also be due to a prolonged water landing? Maybe.
We also have the initial analyses on the flaperon, which say that it was deployed. But in the end, we found that the parts had a common impact. We found 2 parts, one on each side, indicating it was retracted at that moment. We also have parts that are inside the plane that were found, including an in-flight entertainment panel that is normally on a seat. All of this makes me think that the plane broke apart on impact and that it was not set up for a water landing.
We could discuss this at length and find agreement.
Nevertheless,
Argyris Camoulikos studied how a part like the flaperon behaves. By reusing the materials, the shapes, the internal structure, and by making it land on water, like a water landing. And we realize that the tear along the rivets, like a zipper, is actually completely reproducible in this way. So, the fact that it's the mass of water that's being drained. So, as I understand it, your contradictions, as I understand them, it's actually the impact could have broken the connecting rods and pushed the flaperon up. And at that moment, the impact
could have happened as if they had been one
next to.
Yeah. Larry Vance described that very well, and I agree.
It seems credible to me. I'm not completely certain, but
It seems credible to me. Scientifically, I totally agree. It's an option that is entirely possible and would explain why we're not exactly in the right area.
then the internal parts that we have, we say that the plane, there are several theories. I believe Algeria also said that the plane broke into at least 3 parts. And so if we have a fuselage that breaks, obviously we're going to have parts from inside the plane that will break as well. They found the front part of a partition from the plane. We know where this partition is located in the plane. It's the front part. Did the plane break at that spot? Is the deformation we see under the in-flight entertainment panel? Does the part we found not support that this part was there at that moment? At the moment of impact, it was deformed by that impact because the plane broke apart. The theory, well, if we call it a theory, it's a hypothesis, that the plane could have landed on water doesn't mean the plane ended up in one piece. Far from it, that's what we said. That means there's a possibility that the plane broke apart. We can't dismiss the chance that no one was controlling the plane at the end. The area, which has been explored from the beginning, takes into account the fact that no one touched the controls at the end.
That.
It has to be said because people don't know it.
And we didn't find anything. In any case, after the turn to the south, after the Strait of Malaga, that's...
It. Why? Because there's a trajectory that goes in a straight line. So the investigators, they said to themselves, let's make this hypothesis, because the plane is obviously going straight, so maybe there's no one piloting it. We don't know anything yet. And then in the end, they had to narrow it down, because if we take the hypothesis of someone being at the controls, we have an area that will stretch over the entire 7th arc, covering several million square kilometers. And that
it's...
unusable. At first it was simpler, but at first we didn't know.
That's it.
That was the simplest assumption. To narrow down the area...
Your work led to a more precise area. Let's discuss it.
Yes, so it's an area that's much more restricted, right at the edge of the area that's already been scanned. And it represents roughly 350 square nautical miles, and it would take about 5 days to scan it. But obviously, since we don't know what happened, we assume that the plane kept flying straight, that the person at the controls descended almost in a straight line. Well, they could have drifted with the wind, since it was gliding, so we widened the area a little bit. But it's a little bit outside of Arc 7, and I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And already Ocean Infinity is interested.
That's a good thing. So, let's say it again, there are still people today who are analyzing, who continue to work on this crash. The information is so vast and rich that we haven't finished utilizing it. But at the end, the plane, once it sent its 7th arc, its last ping that says there's an electrical recovery, there are no more transmissions. So at this point, we can't be more precise than what we have so far. And after that, it's just hypotheses. It may have been piloted or fallen vertically. We cannot be certain.
No. What we do know is that the sequence involves Logan again. The same Logan from the first arc.
So power outage and restoration?
Exactly. So that means that something really did happen on the power grid. So we interpret it in such a way that, well, not that it is, but in a way that the auxiliary power unit took back control. And since it needed power for the hydraulic pumps, well, it shed the load from the grid of what wasn't necessary.
Because when the engines shut down, and we have proof that the engines shut down by calculating the deceleration of the ping frequency, at that moment I wouldn't go that far. There are indications that it could be that...
It's possible, but not obvious enough to be certain.
That's the hypothesis being mentioned, in any case, absolutely. So, let's just explain anyway. At the end, there's this engine shutdown that causes a deceleration of the plane, which can be analyzed based on the frequency wave that was sent as a deceleration linked to the shutdown of the first engine. So, the plane stops generating electricity with its regular engines, and at that moment, the auxiliary power unit will restart to generate electricity. The sequence in the final seconds of the plane's flight is more well known than the rest of the journey.
It's not that simple. We found out that apparently the fuel in the right engine caused it to stop before the left engine. All right, we'll go with that hypothesis. Now, what happened on board? Does a pilot, if he's flying, expect both engines to stop and just say, well, I'll go check it out? Or does he take control? So we went with the assumption that he was in control, meaning he didn't wait for the left engine to stop. But he thought, I'll save some kerosene for the auxiliary power unit at the back for the generator, and because of that, I'll shut down the left engine myself. And with the auxiliary power unit, I have control of the surfaces to ditch. And because of that, electrically, it matches what happened. That is, there is indeed a power cut, then restoration. since there's the auxiliary power unit, and the engine can't generate power at the same time because of the alternating current. The electricity is cut to allow for resynchronization before supplying power together again. But since he shut down the engine, it causes a break. And that matches pretty well with what happened with the electricity.
So, same thing. Once again, we could have two interpretations. Either the plane went down so quickly that it didn't finish its initialization, or someone at the controls shut off the system and took over the plane.
It got out of his hands as he made several maneuvers, lost the engine and went down a bit. It got away from him before he regained control.
Patrick and Jean-Luc's perspective is intriguing, as it presents a previously unconsidered hypothesis. We've always stuck to the idea that in the end, both engines are lost. The auxiliary power unit starts, so we can trace back to the moment when the satellite reconnects. We go back a minute and a half to determine when the auxiliary power unit started, and therefore determine when the engine shut down. We've always stuck to that idea. And what if someone had started the auxiliary power unit beforehand? To have a plane that's perfectly controllable, to be able to fully extend the flaps, or even to keep the flight controls perfectly manageable. In normal law, that's entirely possible, and that's really a scenario that has never been mentioned. That could be interesting to investigate, and it fits the data well. Exactly.
You can't say, no, it's impossible.
So they're interested. You can
say it's a reading. Well, I believe it or I don't, not really, but you can't say, no, it's not possible. It's possible.
And the authorities, the investigators are interested in these analyses. Yes, absolutely.
And the report is in principle sent to the Australians.
Let's keep our fingers crossed then.
We hope so, yes. If
it can help,
we would like to
finally be able to find them.
But here we're dealing with facts, not sensationalism.
It's a shame it's less Hollywood and won't make it to Netflix. It's less marketable, that's true. I had 4 Skype interviews.
I did 4 Skype calls to explain the data and how to read it, but they never got back to me.
I didn't believe they collaborated with serious individuals, but they intentionally disregarded the technical analyses.
By the way, Mike Exner wrote an article where he's absolutely not happy.
He's not happy because he
said that they were giving false hope, that they were going to base things on facts. Mike Exner shouted foul play and outrage. He accused Blind Gibson of being an English spy, which we didn't discuss. People will claim he's an American spy, but the truth is he's a Russian spy. I don't have an opinion on that, but it's going pretty far.
I advise against watching the 3 45-minute reports, ultimately. No, you have to watch them. You have to watch them. People have the right
to see what they're saying. But then, for example, go watch the video I made to debunk everything point by point, and maybe have a different perspective on all of this.
Come on, we'll put all the links to the reports, to the videos that we've all made. Thanks for being here. This is our longest video since starting at the Recosmos studio, so you may need some time to grasp what we've done. Thank you for your work. We'll be following you closely in the coming months. Thank you both.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed it and that you managed to stay focused until the end. This week's Air Cosmos issue discusses the ongoing major Orion exercises in France. This week's news includes future helicopters and the situation in Ukraine. See you next week at the Air Cosmos studio.